Well, welcome once more, and thank you to everyone for being with us here today. It really is great to be out again, doing these events in person again. We are in the middle of a road show on this topic of housing, and we've been to Savannah, we've been up to Brasstown Valley for a meeting up there. We're going to be in Fayetteville at the Fayette County Chamber of Commerce next week, and then we will be in some other cities in Georgia this fall. So by all means, if you are interested in this topic, you know people who are interested in this topic who live in other parts of Georgia, please let them know to be on the lookout for this coming up later on. But wanted to just give a quick introduction here about who we are and what we do for those of you who may be new to the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. We are not new to Georgia. We've been around since 1991, and we have been working on economic-related policies since then with the idea that if we can improve policy in Georgia, we can improve the lives of people in Georgia, and that is our mission and what we aim to do. We are an independent resource. We act as that for voters, for elected officials, and we want to bring actionable solutions to real-life problems. And in the case of housing, which is one of the many areas we work on, in addition to education, healthcare, economic policy, regulation, taxes, many other areas. In the case of housing, we really do need to help establish what the problem is. Everyone knows home prices are getting to be too unaffordable for too many Georgians, but why is that happening? So we've got a lot of people, friends in government who want to do something about this, and they're working on the problem. And our approach was to say, well, let's take a step back and let's see if they're doing anything to make the problem worse in the first place before we talk about what we can do to solve the problem. So we really have been thinking about how to approach this issue of housing affordability for a few years now, and I'll tell a brief story. I was attending a meeting of the State House Rural Development Council in Dahlonega back in late 2018, and you know I live in Atlanta, but I grew up in Dalton, Georgia, so I know about different parts of the state. But I really, up until that point, I heard about housing affordability as an issue for people in and around Atlanta. That's where I heard most about it. But there was a woman there at that meeting from Gilmer County, Ellijay, Georgia, talking about the shortage of workforce housing there. Now, this is where my bias comes in, being from Dalton. So you got, if you go from the northwest part of the state, you got Dalton, and then outside of Dalton, you get Chatsworth, and then on the other side of the mountain from Chatsworth, you get Ellijay. So it's kind of the other side of the back of the beyond from my perspective from the great metropolis of Dalton. And I remember thinking, how can it be unaffordable for housing in a town like Ellijay? And then the more I talked to people about that, the more I realized every community in Georgia is dealing with a version of this problem. It's not the same everywhere. The causes are not the same. It doesn't look the same everywhere, but everybody's dealing with this. So this is truly a statewide issue for us to examine. A year later, there was a House study committee on workforce housing that delved into this issue. And among other things, they identified that there are 4 drivers of cost. Well, first of all, they identified that a shortage of supply is one of the main problems that we're talking about here. There's just not enough housing being built. We built fewer houses in the last decade, the 2010s, than we did in the last few years of the 90s. I mean, you think about the population growth we've had in Georgia since then, a couple million people added to our state, and yet we're building fewer homes. So that's a problem. And so they identified 4 L's that they said contribute to this problem. Labor, land, and lumber are the first 3. And there's only so much that a state-focused think tank like ourselves really is going to have to say about those 3. But the 4th was laws. And so we decided, okay, how can we contribute to this conversation and look at what the effect of those laws might be on the price of housing. And along the way, we kept hearing that, that the regulatory cost of housing was driving prices up by over 30%, was the number that I remember hearing in one particular conversation. And every time I asked people in the industry about that, they all agreed it's in that arena, and not a much smaller number. So, and I think Chris will be emphasizing this as well, but we didn't start with the premise that the number ought to be zero. There are some legitimate costs, services that have to be provided when property is being developed. And so we're not saying the answer is zero, but it does seem like the number, anecdotally we were hearing, was too high. And so one thing that a think tank can do is go out and establish a data point and do the research to say, well, are these anecdotes correct? Is that what we're really dealing with here? So that gets us up to the study that we published in January, and I'm going to let our Director of Policy and Research, Chris Denson, take it from there.
So as Kyle mentioned, we launched this initiative in 2021. The foundation, of course, was established in 1991, but this was a new policy initiative for the foundation. And our initial steps and foray into this really centered around how do we bring all these stakeholders into a room and try to define what is the problem. And you'll see here I've laid out 4 different buckets: buyers, owners, renters, lenders or bankers, policymakers, builders, developers, and so we started getting representatives from these industries in a room and asked them what are the problems they're seeing when it comes to this issue of housing affordability or lack thereof. And then we set forth and said, okay, if we had 10 years to define this problem, we're going to approach it this way. What is the state doing to make it worse from a legal or regulatory standpoint? What could the state do to make it better? What could the state do to eliminate the worst practices at the local level? And how could the state incentivize the best practices at the local level? And it was during this time that we discovered a study that the National Association of Home Builders does, and they first did it in 2011. And they actually quantify what is the cost of government regulation and the price of a new home, new single-family home. And to go back to the 4 Ls, this is what our federal, state, and local government's doing. This is not, for example, obviously the federal government imposes lumber tariffs, and that drives up the cost of lumber, but that's more of an indirect cost this study did not seek to address. And so my co-author on this study, Paul Emrath, had published previous versions of this study in 2011 and 2016. And he says that the best way to figure out the true cost of what these regulations mean when it comes to building a home is you have to ask the people that are building them. So he surveyed home builders in 2011 and 2016. And in 2021, he performed the first study in which he included lot developers. And this is also an integral cost to the price of a new home as well. And so he conducted his study in October and so from there, we spoke with him. I reached out to him, and I asked him if he'd be interested in conducting a state study of this. He said, yes, he'd be interested. And so I said, well, can I just get the data for what it shows in Georgia? And he said, no. And I said, so is that because you don't have it or you're not willing to share it with me? He said, well, we don't actually track what it is at the state level, what it is in major metropolitan cities. But if you're willing to survey home builders, then we'll run the study in conjunction with you. So we moved forward, and in partnership with the Home Builders of Georgia, Home Builders Association of Georgia, we conducted the first known state or local study of the cost of regulation in a new single-family home. We sent this survey electronically to 986 members of the Home Builders of Georgia, and we received responses that we were able to use and for this study from 55 home builders and 31 lot developers. And as Kyle mentioned earlier, the purpose of this study is not to say that all regulation in building a home or developing a lot is bad, but we sought to put a cost on it just so state and local policymakers would have an idea of how these policy decisions translate towards the cost of a home and how it impacts the availability of affordable housing and the overall supply. And so you'll see here, this is these charts compare the overall cost in the state of Georgia to the national average. And then below that are two breakdowns comparing the regulatory cost during construction of the home and then the regulatory cost during lot development. And so at the very top, you'll see that nationally, regulations accounted for 23.8% of the cost of a new single-family home. In Georgia was over 3 percentage points higher at 26.9%. And then that similar breakdown was seen here for regulatory costs during construction. That was 13.3% added to the price of a new single-family home nationally, but 15.6% in Georgia. And during lot development, it was 10.5% nationally and 11.3% here in Georgia. And so I'm going to go through and break down those costs when it comes to developing a lot for new single-family housing. But this pie chart here is a breakdown of that 11.3% that is added, in terms of cost to developing the lot for a new single-family home. That kind of orange shade is the hard cost of compliance. That accounts for 3.3%. Now, for each of these, I'll go into a little bit more of a breakdown on each and what some examples are and how that cost comes about. But the highest here were hard cost of compliance at 3.3%. Land dedicated to the government added 3.2%. And then the yellow standards that go beyond the ordinary was 2.6%. So I'll dive in and break down a little bit of each of these, but I just want to explain how this chart functions first. So you'll see share of the regulatory cost as your first column. And what that did was it compares every survey respondent and whether or not they encountered some type of cost for this particular regulation. And then average when present means that if they said, if they entered anything greater than 0, we average that number out. And then the average across all lots is the average including zeros. So that is the standard number that we use if you go back to the previous charts in both the state and the national study. And that's the one I'll be referring to throughout. But the first stage here when it comes to developing a lot for a new single-family home is the development. And this accounts for those fees that are paid directly to the government and include requirements for environmental impact, traffic, archaeological, or other studies. And so this is actually an outlier here in that the state average was lower than the national average, but this added 1.3% to the cost of a new home in Georgia and 1.6% nationally. But you'll see that every Georgia respondent encountered this type of cost when developing the lot statewide. Okay, our next step is the hard cost of compliance, and that's regulatory costs after obtaining zoning, but later during the development process. And so these include requirements to mitigate environmental impacts and other fees, and impact fees, which is a big term we hear a lot when we're talking about housing affordability, is included in this, along with utility fees for utility hookup and other fees as well. We'll see both state and nationally, each respondent encountered this type of fee developing the lot, but in the state of Georgia, it was 3.3% compared to 3% nationally. Your next category is land dedicated to the government during lot development, and this would include land that's dedicated for parks or green spaces or land for schools. And so the important thing with this one is the developer must pay for the land but not derive revenue from it. And so the interesting thing about this particular statistic and what we discovered in the survey is that there's a lower percentage of Georgia lot developers that incurred this cost, just over 86% compared to 94% nationally, but the cost was higher among Georgia. So it was over 3%, 3.2% compared to 2.8% nationally. Lot developers deal with architectural and aesthetic design standards just like home builders do. And so in the survey, we assume that developers have standard requirements when they're developing a lot. So this question asks for those costs that are imposed on them above and beyond. Examples include specific requirements for lot size or design, sidewalks, landscaping requirements, setbacks. And so what's unique about this is Georgia respondents dealt with this at a significantly higher percentage than their national colleagues did. Nearly 93% of Georgia developers dealt with this, just over 85% nationally. And so the cost breakdown for that one is 2.6%. This adds 2.6% of the cost of a new single-family home in Georgia compared to 2.3% nationally. And so OSHA and labor requirements, you'll see here in terms of share of the regulatory cost, it's not quite as high and doesn't add quite as much overall, but there are several federal labor standards that some states, some local, but this was the second lowest. It adds 0.6% of the cost to the cost of a new single-family home in Georgia. And then pure cost of delay is an interesting, because if you talk to any developers, you talk to any builders, they talk about the delay and carrying a loan and the interest rate that accrues. And so you'll see here, both state and nationally, it only adds 0.4% to the cost. This is also something we surveyed among builders as well. And truly, both throughout the survey, publishing the study, and talking to developers and builders afterwards, we felt like future versions of the study really represent an opportunity to gain a truer, more accurate cost on this, because just comparison-wise, 0.4% seems relatively low compared to the numbers that you hear so many developers and builders have to carry. But both the state and national average for this was roughly 6 months of delay were added to building a new single-family home. And of course, the longer it takes to develop the lot, interest in the development loan will accrue. But every developer in Georgia that responded experienced some type of delay. And so this is just a slide that shows overall, again, that 11.3% compared to the national average for lot development. Both state and federal respondents all report at least some regulatory cost. But yeah, so this pie chart here shows the breakdown of the regulatory costs during construction, which accounts for 15.6% of the cost of a new single-family home in Georgia. The orange is 7%, and that changes to building codes over the last 10 years that builders are forced to comply with. The silver or gray on the block on the side is 4.1%, and those are your architectural design standards. And then red, the top 2.3 are fees paid by the builder after purchasing the lot. That's impact fees assessed to builders on top of those already assessed to developers. And if there's anything that we've heard during our discussion with builders, it's that changes to building codes, architectural design standards, impact fees are what add to the cost, and this pie chart reflects that. And so this is just the comparison here. Going back to the impact fees, you'll see significantly higher respondents in Georgia, significantly higher respondents of builders documented, dealing with this. And but interestingly enough, it was slightly lower than the national average. Those changes to building codes. Yet again, more Georgia builders responded to dealing with this at a higher rate than their national counterparts, nearly 98% compared to just over 90%, and then almost a full percentage point higher, and then it added 7% to the cost of a new home. And I've made a note here that this was the costliest regulation both in Georgia and nationally. Examples of this would be energy requirements or fire code changes that the builders are forced to comply with. All right, so architectural design standards. So many of our communities across Metro Atlanta, it's been in the news, they've sought to impose architectural design standards. This is often, as my co-author Paul Emrath notes, motivated by aesthetics or sometimes even to possibly price less affluent residents out of neighborhoods. One example of this that we've seen is the prohibition of vinyl siding in some communities. And some other examples that have been seen across the nation include requirements for garage orientation, for example, or material used in fences, window shutters, square footage of window space. And so if there's anything that I would ask you to take away from this slide, not only to think about if your community is assessing or putting these into place, but I mean, if you look at the share of the regulatory cost, over 71% of Georgia builders say they deal with this regulation, compared to under 58% nationally. It accounts for 4.1% of the cost of a new home, compared to 2.7% nationally. But as you probably noticed throughout, I mean, a delta of nearly 14% is significantly higher than the difference in respondents, both state and nationally, in these other standards. And so another just interesting thing we discovered during this study is that state respondents deal with labor regulations at a much higher cost than their national counterparts. This was the highest difference in terms of state versus national. I mean, 80% of Georgia builders, so they dealt with this cost, compared to under 64% nationally. Some examples here that I've included that the National Association of Home Builders have either addressed or worked on over the years. That there's a beryllium code out of OSHA that was a mandate that doesn't really exist in residential construction, and just a couple others here as well that provide examples for some of the labor requirements that the builders deal with. And then yet again, this same thing as I mentioned with the development, the cost of delay. We feel like probably subsequent studies will reflect this higher. There's a few things we're looking at perhaps to tweak after speaking with some builders and developers since the publication of the study, but it accounts for 0.4% of the cost of a new home. Georgia respondents dealt with this at a higher average, and our state average was roughly 8 weeks. So zoning or regulatory delays added 8 weeks to the cost of building a new home here in Georgia. And this slide again just shows overall each Georgia respondent dealt with some type of regulatory cost, and yet again it was 15.6% of the cost of a new home came from building regulations, compared to 13.3% nationally. There's just a few takeaways here. So compared to the national averages, a higher share of Georgia lot developers and builders reported incurring each type of regulatory cost listed in the survey, with the exception of the hard cost of compliance during development, and that's because both were at 100%, and then land dedicated to the government. So Georgia respondents were nearly 8 percentage points lower in terms of their requirement to dedicate land to the government. But the differences were notably larger among Georgia home builders during construction for those architectural design standards, nearly 14%, and the OSHA labor compliance, which was over 16%. So I've given you a lot of percentage points, right? So this chart we did here, which can be converted depending on what the local cost, like local averages for the cost of a new single-family home. But this took all those percentages and applied it to, okay, if there was a new home that was $350,000, then what would that mean if you took all these percentages? And so it says that if you're paying $350,000 for a new single-family home in Georgia, then nearly $95,000 can be attributed to the cost of regulation. And so we put this in an Excel spreadsheet. We can convert that number, it'd be 400,000, be 250. And so Kyle had mentioned some of our statewide meetings earlier. That's another pitch. If there's a local, if $350,000 doesn't seem right in your community, we can easily change it, but $350,000 is what we've shown here. And just for example, the biggest or the largest percentage were those changes to the building codes over the past 10 years. I mean, in this scenario, that accounts for nearly $25,000 of the cost of a new single-family home here in Georgia. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but on your sheet, on your tables, you'll see a sheet, and it's a press release after the housing study came out, and that QR code at the bottom will take you to our landing page of the Georgia Policy website for all of our housing materials we've published since 2021, including the breakdown and conversion of all those percentages into this table. So Kyle touched on this earlier. I won't spend too much time, but we've already completed several dates statewide. We have a couple more coming up, and we're also working on more fall cities. Once kids are back in school and everybody's schedule's a little bit more back to normal. But we're trying to share the word on this. And one other thing I will say as well is that if there are any civic meetings that you think would be worthwhile, Kyle or myself are happy to share this study and travel the state and really just share everything we've done so far to date and what this study shows. We're currently working on a study that is an analysis of Georgia's impact fees. There are currently 54 jurisdictions across the state that assess these. And for the most part, they're listed publicly, but the prices really vary, and the requirements, what they're allocated for in different communities. And so what we're looking to do is compile the first known listing of every impact fee, and then really examine what the efficacy is in terms of them going towards what local officials say they're being put towards. And then once we're done with that, we're actually looking to replicate the similar study that I just walked you through here today with multifamily housing. The National Association of Home Builders last conducted their national study on multifamily homes in 2018. They're currently doing that now, and so we are looking to have a similar breakdown between both national and state for multifamily housing, as it's such an integral part of workforce housing as well. And so I put my contact information here. We're going to open it up for Q&A, but in case anyone has any questions they'd like to ask outside of today and reach out to discuss the study, my contact information is up here, and it looks like I already have one question. And so Kennedy is going around trying to collect these. Looks like we have a couple others. And so our first question: if you could overturn only one building regulation in Georgia, what would it be? You haven't?
I'll chime in on this. I don't know that we're quite to that point yet. We're still trying to identify what does the landscape look like, what does the effect look like. I think it would require some further analysis to say, okay, take the largest number was 7% for changes to the building code over the last 10 years. How much reduction is really possible there? That's a question that we aren't able to answer just yet. It's something we want to look at. But I would say generally, it's probably going to be chipping away at each of these different factors a little bit, right? It's not going to be eliminating a category for the most part. It's not going to be, maybe you cut one in half. I don't know. Like I said, we haven't done that analysis yet. But I think it's going to be looking for opportunities to whittle away at it on each of those points. And so I don't think we're at a point yet where we could say, this is the number one culprit, let's go after this first.
All right. So another question we received here, and I had several along these lines, so I'm going to combine them into one. But what is the price, how much has it increased over the past 10 years? In 2011, that was the first known study that NHB conducted. And I was just able to pull up here the comparison. And so in 2011, when NHB conducted this study in terms of taking the current average price of a new home then versus now, it added $65,000 to the cost of a new home, and then nationally it was just under $94,000. So nearly $30,000 added to the price of a new home over the past 10 years.
And we do plan to replicate this study down the road so that we have a trend over time in Georgia. I don't think Chris mentioned during his presentation, but the first thing we heard from Paul at the NAHB was, 100 people have asked me if they could do this, and I told them all, sure, and none of them have actually done it. So we are the first ones to actually come back to him with the data and say, okay, we did it. And so I think he was a little surprised and maybe a little impressed with that. But he's a good partner for us to work with, and we do plan to go back and do this study in the future. And we'd really like, couple of years from now, to do it again with a larger sample size so that we can establish a figure for different markets within Georgia. This is just a statewide number. We would love to be able to say, here's what it's like in Metro Atlanta versus Columbus versus Savannah. We didn't have the sample size to do that this time, so that's a goal of ours next time is to have that larger sample so that we can do a breakdown as well.
All right, I received a question here about increasing density to lower unit costs and increase housing supply, and that's definitely one issue we've come across here. And so, I will say with this study, we wanted to try to assess the quantitative impact overall and show what the cost of these regulations were. But yes, of course, if you decrease supply, obviously you have an increased demand, which is a lot of what this is looking at. And so, that's one thing we hear too, is that these type of regulations that we're trying to quantify, they actually incentivize builders to build larger homes on higher lots because they just have to deal with so much regulatory cost.
Yeah, some of these are just more fixed cost rather than as a proportion of the unit. And so if you're dealing with that, you might as well build the largest, most expensive house you can so that you absorb that fixed cost better. And I think the multifamily study, when we do that, will shed some light maybe on the density question and whether there's something to be gained there.
All right, our next question, what is the interest at the state capitol to deal with these regulations? And I will say, I know this year the state legislature, they're investing in another study committee to go back and revisit this. Several folks in the room I know are involved with that effort, and so I think there is an appetite, just especially given the surge in population we've seen over the last 2 years and just the lack of workforce housing in so many communities.
We'll get time for maybe one more question.
I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll just end it right there and give you a couple minutes extra at the end of the event. But thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you being with us today. We do encourage you to use this QR code, just like the menus at some restaurants that you've come across. We've all kind of learned how to deal with these the last couple of years. But go there, check out our other work on housing, other topics, and I would always be remiss if I missed the opportunity at an event like this to say we are a totally privately funded organization. We don't solicit or accept any government funding, so there will be a donate button at the top of the website. If you've liked what you heard today, please click there and send some support our way. It does help us to do more of this kind of work, and as Chris outlined, we have a pretty healthy schedule of this kind of work on this topic, as well as many others coming in the rest of this year and in the years to come. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll go ahead and be adjourned.